All right, let us be. But I did, when I got home last night, I Googled. Google is a great thing. And I have read 2 reviews of his book.
But thankfully, both of them are good.
Yeah, they were very good. But I just want to pick out one sentence. It says, "It is a startlingly unfamiliar picture of our national and international history." You could say that again. It's startlingly unfamiliar. So will you fill us in on the background to the book that you've written and why it was that it attracted you to write this aspect of Queen Elizabeth's reign?
Well, it is funny being chaired by you because, I'm 47 and I grew up, I was born in Bradford in 1969, and I grew up there in the 70s and 80s. I went to a state school, and so you were part of my political landscape at that time, which is why it's wonderful to be chaired by you, because it is part of the story that being in Bradford, and many of you will know the multicultural history of Bradford. I went to school. It was not an elite cosmopolitan story of cultural exchange with other faiths and cultures, but a lot of my mates were Muslim, were Sikh and Hindu. So for me, it was telling this story is part of our national story. I'm probably odd in a way because I then went on, I actually teach literature. I'm not a historian, I teach literature at London University. And throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, I was working on, I'm going to talk about maps later on today, talking about maps of the period. And the maps of this period show you that the great power at this time is as much Spain as the Ottoman Islamic Empire. And so this got me thinking that, I came from a background where I understood that, there was exchange between different faiths and different religions and different cultures. And I wanted to write a book which effectively explained why Shakespeare wrote a play called Othello. Why in 1601 does he suddenly produce a play about a Muslim convert who is Othello, who's living in Venice? The play ends with Shakespeare writing about Aleppo. Why is Shakespeare writing about Aleppo in 1601? So for many, many years, when I was teaching Shakespeare at Queen Mary in a very diverse part of East London, I used to say to students, here is a bit from Shakespeare's Othello. He's talking about Aleppo. In a room 3 times the size of this, I'd say to the students, prior to the civil war in Syria, I'd say, where is Aleppo? And nobody could tell me. This was throughout the late 90s, 2000s. Yeah. Tragically, of course, now we all know where Aleppo is. So what I wanted to do was to do the history that said, we have completely missed this story about the fact that Elizabethan England and its dramatists like Shakespeare were fully aware of an engagement with the Islamic world, that Queen Elizabeth was herself working very closely with the Ottoman Empire, the Persian Empire, and the Moroccan Empire throughout her reign. And that this is a part of our national story which we simply have not been told. Partly because most people who work on this period of literature and history are trained in that elite Greco-Roman tradition. And they do not learn Arabic. I myself don't have Arabic, but they don't learn anything about cultures to the east of Venice. Now that, it seems to me, has completely skewed our understanding of this period of history. And I've got some pictures to show, and I'll just dip in and out. So this, for instance, this is a painting by an English painter called Hans Ureth from the 1550s. And it's a painting of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the greatest ruler in the early 16th century, by far more important than the Habsburg Spanish Emperor Charles V, than the Portuguese King John III. Suleiman, of course, ruled everywhere up to Vienna, was in Budapest, everything to the east, all of North Africa, all of Central Asia. And here were the English in the 1550s painting Suleiman the Magnificent on horseback, saying, this guy is incredibly significant, he's incredibly powerful. And this is from the 1550s. So what's interesting is that, of course, we can't have any conversations, it seems to me, at the moment without Brexit. But this is very interesting because the book came out, and I've been working on the book for several years. But of course, with Brexit, I looked at what was going on with Brexit, and I thought, my God, this is a similar story to what I'm telling in the book. This is a period where, for theological reasons, the English completely cut themselves off from Europe. So the break with Rome under Henry VIII in the 1530s leads to a sort of theological iron curtain that falls over England. We are cut out, I say we. England is completely cut off from the High Renaissance. People are not allowed to travel without permits. And I always say about this period that Elizabethan England is a bit like Romania under the former Soviet bloc. It is not this great, powerful place. Right? It is completely isolated. It's completely cut off from Europe. The response by Elizabeth in the from the 1550s into the 1560s is to therefore turn to the Islamic world and say, my Protestant nation can work with Islam because there are interesting theological affinities, and our common enemy is European and particularly Spanish Catholicism. So throughout this period, Elizabeth is reaching out to the Ottomans particularly.
But anyone who's travelled in Spain as a tourist knows that Spain used to be part of the Moorish Empire, but this was long before the period you're writing about, presumably.
Absolutely. So, of course, that moment's happened with Spain from the late 15th century, the expulsion, of course, of the Muslims. So this is a later moment,
right,
which is post the Reformation. So, of course, the Reformation comes along, and the split between between Catholicism and Protestantism with Luther in the 1520s means that a divided Christianity looks at the Islamic world in a very different way.
Exactly, yeah.
And Protestantism, when Luther first is writing in the 15-teens, 1520s, he makes comments saying, you know what, we have various affinities with Islam. Luther is involved in...
More than with the Catholic Church.
More than with Catholics, because we don't believe in intercession.
Yeah.
We believe in the power of the book, and we believe in the word of God. And Luther gets into a lot of trouble immediately for doing this. But what you get is a split in Christianity, because a lot of Protestants therefore say, yeah, we're heretics as well. Of course, Christianity doesn't understand properly Islam. It just sees it as a heresy. And so a lot of the theological debates in this period say Lutheranism, Protestantism is just like Islam. It's just another heresy. So Queen Elizabeth says, fine, okay, then we can do business with these people. These are letters, you can see on the screen, these are letters from the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan Murad III. These are letters from the late 1570s, writing to Elizabeth. Very cordially, Elizabeth writes back, says, you know, I'm the ruler of England, you probably don't know who I am, because they don't. They've no idea where and what England is. She reaches out as a supplicant. She says to the Ottoman emperor, I will basically be a supplicant. She signs commercial deals with them and says, I am basically a vassal state of your empire, because I know you're the greater empire. And Murad writes back and says, great, don't know who you are, but it's nice to have you on board, it's absolutely fine. Your people can come, I'm not really interested in you, because all you've got to offer is wool, and we don't need wool. What is extraordinary is that from the late 1570s, what Elizabeth starts to sanction is arms to Istanbul.
Oh.
So, you know, we talk about arms to Iraq and we talk about the Iran-Contra attack. This starts with Elizabeth in the 1570s. Elizabeth is she sends the first English ambassador who goes to Istanbul, Constantinople, is a man called William Harborne. He's from Great Yarmouth. He's a merchant. He's sent over, he gets there in 1578. By 1579, he's involved in shipments of armaments that come from London to Istanbul that are arming Muslim Ottoman soldiers fighting not only Shia Persia, right? So this is an interesting moment as well where the English are understanding the distinction between Islam in terms of Sunni and Shia. How many of us know that? Now, if we call ourselves white Western Europeans, how many people now today could tell me the theological distinction between Sunni and Shia?
No.
Well, they could in the 1570s in England.
Right.
Harborne goes out there, and he's actually receiving shipments of armaments, which are rather wonderfully coming from deconsecrated Catholic churches. Elizabeth orders the stripping of lead and other alloys from the churches for armaments that then go out to the Ottomans. And the Spanish are furious about this. I mean, I could have put up letters where the Spanish say, this is absolutely outrageous what the English are doing. And Elizabeth saying, well, I've been excommunicated. So
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the excommunication, because what triggered that? I always assumed that she was never a member of the Catholic Church, but she must have been.
well, officially she still was, because so in 1570, this is the papal bull which excommunicates her. So she comes to the throne in 1558. Now, officially, no, that she hasn't really embraced. She's played a very clever game. She hasn't fully embraced Calvinism. And she never really does. She plays this very, very deft game. And traditionally, historians always say the bull to excommunicate her is an absolute disaster as far as the Catholics are concerned, because up until this point, there's a sort of acceptance that, you know, Protestants and Catholics can quietly do what they need to do. Her hand is forced by Pius V because he decides to get excommunicated. And of course that means that all observant English Catholics are then asked to effectively overthrow Elizabeth. And Jesse Charles has written an interesting book about this, I forgot that, which is about Catholic recusants, effectively saying, you know, what then happens is that English Catholics are effectively seen as terrorists. You know, Jim Shapiro writes the book about 1606 recently about the gunpowder plot. You know, the volatility of seeing Catholics trying to blow up the state in 1605 with the gunpowder plot is incredibly powerful. So Catholicism at this point then becomes effectively the enemy within.
And we need to be clear also at the beginning that we're talking about English history, because the Scots at this time were so obsessed by the disaster of Flodden that they were not part of geopolitics at all. Am I right?
Yeah, and of course this is very significant because James is waiting in the wings to take over. Yeah. And my story effectively ends in 1603 because when Elizabeth dies, James comes to the throne. Yeah. And again, it is a very Brexit moment because what he says is Elizabeth has made all these alliances with the Islamic world, but economically, the country is basically still in an absolute ruinous state because of its exile self-imposed from Europe. The first thing that he does is he says we have to make peace with Spain. 1604, he has the Treaty of London. They make peace with Spain. There's a famous painting, the Somerset House painting of the two teams agreeing a deal. That immediately at a stroke means that England's relationship with the Islamic world are no longer needed because the English are then allowed to travel and trade again with Iberia and with Europe without the threat of the Inquisition. And it really kickstarts the Grand Tour. That's when the English start travelling and going, oh my God, look at what they've been doing in Italy for the last 100 years. Look at this amazing art, and they've just been completely cut out from it. So at that point, the story of the Anglo-Islamic relations sort of, it changes and shifts. Right. But under Elizabeth, it's this remarkable moment that nobody has really told the story. So with the Armada in 1588, my friend William Harborne, still in Istanbul as the ambassador, trading with the Turks, trading with, here's Murad III, the Ottoman Sultan. And, you know, I show that because that is an image that I imagine many of you are completely unfamiliar with. Well, he was probably the most important emperor in the late 16th century. And I show it again to give you, look how Chinese the influence there is of an authentic Ottoman miniature of Murad III. So Elizabeth and Harborne are working with Murad, and Harborne is trying to persuade Murad to fight the Spanish in the Mediterranean, to split the fleet that will sail, that they know inevitably is going to sail to England, which is the Spanish Armada.
The Armada, yeah.
And I've talked about this before, saying, you know, that we thank Francis Drake for defeating the Armada, but there's another aspect, which is the Anglo-Islamic story about how they're trying to keep the Spanish at bay in the Mediterranean so that the fleet that sails to England, as it does in 1588, is somewhat diminished.
So was it as much about trade as about theology?
It's a really good question. I mean, they're talking across both aspects. So they talk about Harborne as the Lutheran ambassador. The Turks absolutely get Lutheranism. Yeah. They get what it is, they get that it's splitting Christianity, and therefore they can do a deal with these people. But as you say, effectively what Harborne's official remit is trade. And they're trying to really open up a trade which gives them, of course, all the wealth of the East, silk, spices, all the things that we know that comes from the East, in exchange, of course, for wool. nobody really wants wool. Sue's here. Sue and I have been talking about the way in which that kind of trade works in the period. And again, the English are trying to work in Morocco, and they're saying, we have a limited market for wool, so what can we offer you? Arms. They're doing deals with arms again. In exchange, they're getting saltpeter from Morocco for guns, for bullets. And the other thing, of course, is that they're getting sugar. What do we know about Queen Elizabeth's teeth? Okay?
Teeth,
It doesn't
yeah.
smile.
Yeah.
It's Moroccan sugar. So the way in which that Anglo-Islamic relation works, permeates all aspects of society. You open any late Elizabethan cookbook and you see the ingredients, and many of them will be from the Islamic world.
Now, you mentioned earlier the influence on Shakespeare. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Do you know that Shakespeare talks about the Prophet Muhammad in one of his plays? Who knew that? Who's read Henry VI Part 1? Nobody's read Henry VI Part 1. So in Henry VI Part 1, you can look it up, that the French king makes a comment about Joan of Arc, effectively, and says, you are amazing, you're like the Prophet Muhammad, you're this amazing sort of figure. And nobody's ever commented on this. Completely remarkable in one of Shakespeare's first plays, early 1590s. He mentions the Prophet Muhammad. Now again, the casualness of that suggests, and this is why I've done the history in the book, to then say it affects the drama. The drama is clearly picking up on this generation of history that's been going on really since the 1540s, 1550s. And every Elizabethan dramatist writes about Muslims in some ways. They might call them Persians, they might call them Moors, they might call them Turks, various names. The use of the term Islam only enters English in 1615. That's the first usage of the term. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a very confused but an engagement with what we would call the Islamic world. Hence the title. I use the term the Islamic world in the title. It's a bit clunky. So Shakespeare is endlessly, throughout his history plays, if you look at the history plays, he's always talking about Turks. He's talking about Moors, Prophet Muhammad in Henry VI Part 1, Titus Andronicus, one of his early tragedies, which we date to about 1594. Who's the great evil figure? It is Aaron the Moor. That means that he's a black man from Morocco. Merchant of Venice, 5 years later, he writes another play, and in the middle of the play that we're obsessed with thinking is about Jews, and we think of it, is it anti-Semitic, is it philo-Semitic? Well, in the middle of that play, one of Portia's suitors is the Prince of Morocco. Just out of nowhere, the Prince of Morocco is one of her suitors. And she turns him down and he just disappears, he just walks out of the play. And then, in 1601, 1602, Shakespeare writes Othello about a Moor. And what fascinates me about Othello is I connect him to this figure. This is a portrait of the Moroccan ambassador called Muhammad al-Anouri. And Muhammad al-Anouri arrives in England in late 1600. He arrives with a large retinue. They are put up royally on the Strand in London. He's come as a high-level diplomatic figure from the ruler of Morocco to establish an Anglo-Moroccan trade and military alliance to attack Spain. This guy then turns up, and we know quite a bit about him because if you can see the portrait we have in Latin, we're told that the date, it's 1600. We're given an anglicised version of his name. We're told his age, he's 42, and that he is the he's the diplomatic legate, he's the diplomatic ambassador from Barbary. He stays in the Strand. He stays there for 6 months. He has various meetings with Elizabeth. The alliance only fails. It fails because Elizabeth doesn't want to set a Moroccan alliance against her Ottoman alliance. It's not because this guy's Muslim. It's because she fears that the Ottomans will be annoyed if she allies herself with the Moroccans. Because at the time, some of you may know this, but you probably don't. We don't know about North African history in the late 16th century, many of us. That the Ottomans are actually in conflict with the Sardian dynasty of Morocco, which is where al-Anouri comes from. Now, he leaves in the spring of 1601. Shakespeare writes Othello in late 1601. and it's about a Moor from Morocco who says, I've converted to Christianity. We now know what's fascinating. We understand that this guy, scholars read the turbans. The turbans suggest that he's actually not a native-born Moroccan. He's actually a Spanish-born Muslim. He's what's called a Morisco, who would have been forcibly converted by the Spanish,
right,
because, as you said, the whole expulsion of the Muslims, of the Moors, meant that any Muslim communities which were still in Spain would be forcibly converted. This guy was probably forcibly converted, left Spain somehow, gets to Morocco. Because of that cosmopolitan history, he's chosen to go to London in 1600, deals with Elizabeth, and I think that Shakespeare probably sees him or knows about this figure. Everybody's writing about him in 1600. And then Shakespeare writes a play about a guy who says, well, I'm from Morocco, but you don't quite know what my religion or my background is. You don't know how to trust me, whether I should be trusted or not. I think the backstory of Othello is maybe not deliberately identifiably this figure, but it's everything that is embodied in that portrait that the book tells the story about. And, you know, we don't know this story. We always think of Elizabethan England, you know, it's about Englishness, you know, it's about merry England, you know, it's about London. This is a nonsense. This is parochial, insular English national history at its worst, right? It's wrong, wrong, wrong. And we shouldn't carry on teaching it. And, you know, as I said, from somebody who comes from Bradford, and I work in the East End of London, this is the story that we should be telling.
Now, your reviewers say that you write so beautifully, that you give these pen portraits of various people. One that fascinated me was about the guy who went out with an organ. Can you tell us about that? Because it was really funny.
What's interesting about these stories is that we only have some of the more elite figures. A lot of these characters that I'm writing about in the book, we just don't have any portraits of. So I don't have any portraits of William Harborne, who's the first ambassador, an extraordinary man, you know, does incredible things in Istanbul. We don't have portraits of many of the merchants. Another figure that we don't have is the figure that David's talking about, and a remarkable man who I came across called Thomas Dallam. And Thomas Dallam is an artisan who's from Warrington in Lancashire, very poor, but brilliant artisan, who he makes organs. He makes mechanical organs, water-based organs, which Elizabeth hears him play and is amazed by this. And I must be careful, you know, I wouldn't say Elizabeth was amazed by Dallam's organ, which sounded terribly wrong. So and I went, oh my, oh. Thankfully, less people laughed. But so there's all these kind of funny jokes that are made about Dallam and his organ, and she sends him out to Istanbul. She says, I need to send a gift to Istanbul, to Murad III. You're going to go out with your organ and play it for him. And so this guy from Warrington goes to Istanbul in 1599, gets there, unpacks the organ. The organ's broken. He sits in front of the Topkapi Saray, the royal palace, and puts it back together to the bemusement of the Turks who are watching. He then takes it into the palace. He plays in front of the Sultan, who is completely entranced, thinks this is absolutely wonderful, offers him the pick of his harem. He's the first Englishman to peep into the harem. And it's quite funny because, you know, he says, oh, I looked in and he said, I did like the lady's thighs, you know, these kind of wonderful Elizabethan little pen portraits. Murad says, please stay. I'd love you to convert as many of your English friends have. Another story about how conversion takes place. So I'm going to keep on with Dallam, and I'm just going to show you another figure who, this is another of his mates. Now this, as you look at this figure in an opulent oriental dress with a turban, well, this is Samson Rowley. He's from Great Yarmouth. And in 1578, he goes out into the Mediterranean as part of this Anglo-Islamic moment. He's captured by the Turks. He is taken to Algiers. He's castrated. He becomes a eunuch. He's converted to Islam. And then he rules Algiers. He's effectively the royal eunuch and treasurer of Algiers throughout the 1570s and 1580s. The guy I'm talking to you about, William Harborne, the English ambassador, also from Great Yarmouth, writes to this guy. He becomes known as Hassan Aga. And he writes to him and he says, oh, you've got some English people that we need releasing, can we do a deal? And Samson Rowley, a.k.a. Hassan Agar, writes back and he says, no, sorry, I can't help. And Harborne says, and would you like to reconvert and come back? And he goes, I live in a palace in Algiers, and you want me to come back to Great Yarmouth? So this is what's happening, that we're looking at this period down the wrong end of the telescope. You know, all the kind of current debates about, you know, the British Muslim community, you know, and the problematic way in which that's talked about. And I'm saying, in this period, England was a vassal state of the Islamic world. And actually, it's people like Samson Rowley and Thomas Dallam saying, actually, you know, at this point in time, allying yourself with Islam is probably a better bet than Protestantism, which may not make it. You know, the Armada looks like it's going to wipe England and Protestantism off the map. So to convert to Islam, as many of these English men and women are doing, might seem like a good idea. And Dallam's story, I'll just end with that because then I know we're going to go to questions. Dallam's story is fascinating. Dallam then says he's going to go home, and he leaves, and he's traveling, and he's given a dragoman, an interpreter, a Turkish interpreter. And he's traveling back through Greece to then get back through Europe. And he discovers that the Turkish interpreter, translator, is a man from Chorley, who's down the road from Warrington, who's converted to Islam. And they travel through most of Greece, and then the guy from Chorley leaves and goes back to Istanbul. Dallam comes home. And in fact, he carries on, and he makes the organ for King's College Chapel in Cambridge. But I love that moment that here are two working class blokes from Lancashire, you know, from within about 10 miles of each other. And one says, I'm going back, I'm a Muslim. And the other says, see ya. And I love that
A last
story.
question from me before I throw it over to the audience. Are there any lessons from this period that you've been studying for today with the problems of Islamic extremism?
Well, I mean, it just, I think, tells you that our own approach to national history, I think, needs to change within this period. So we've been celebrating Shakespeare 400 this year, and it has been exclusively about white Englishness. Yeah. And I want to say, you know, to a British Muslim community, which I would say is, I think, under attack in this country at the moment, there is a longer history and heritage of an Anglo-Islamic relationship, which is not just post-1947. So we should bear that in mind. And I think also it's a story of these moments where an attempt at understanding across the faiths trumps trade and it trumps theology. Right. This is a time where both cultures are trying to get on with each other. And all my characters, this is what is spooky about writing the book, they're traveling through Aleppo, Raqqa, Baghdad, and the Islamic world is saying, that's fine. Yeah. That is fine with us because it's a sign of our power that we can assimilate you. You are known as Jimmy, some of you will know this. You pay a tax, we don't care what faith you are, it is a sign of our tolerance and our power, particularly the Ottoman Empire, to say we don't care if you're Jews or you're Protestants or you're Catholics, we don't care. We are powerful enough to assimilate you. So yes, in a way, I hope it does, because I do want to sort of say there's a longer history here, and there's a moment where, as it were, the West is trying to engage and understand in a way that I don't think is happening now. Because as I say, that powerful moment of these English men saying, we're trying to understand the distinction between Sunni and Shia. How can we ever begin to understand the current conflict, where many people who are engaging with it don't understand that? They don't know the longer history of the caliphate, which of course is at play here, isn't anymore. So it seems to me that this is just part of a way of telling different histories to understand the present that we're currently in.
Well, thank you very much. Now let's go to the audience. We've got a roving microphone. If you stick your hand up, the microphone will come to you. Yes, right in the front here. Third row.
Thank you for a great presentation.
Thank you.
And fascinating area of research. I wonder if you have investigated the transfer, if you like, of knowledge from the Islamic world in the Elizabethan period. I'm thinking about the influence of early Islamic thought on people like John Dee, who was critical in the Elizabethan court. You know, I know that he had quite, probably the largest collection of early Islamic texts and knowledge, particularly on optics and things like that. So I'm just curious about how you think that kind of transfer of, or if you like, the intellectual influence more than the political influence, the degree to which you may have investigated that in your work. Just be interested to know how you think that kind of happened and what kind of intellectual influence actually came from, if you like, manuscript sources, which I believe came very much in Latin translation through Toledo, but maybe you can elaborate.
Exactly, yeah. Well, I've written before about this. I mean, in the High Renaissance, I think it's more a moment in Italy where that transference starts to happen because, as you say, it does come through Latin, but there's just a simple problem about language. The Quran is only badly translated in English for the first time in 1649, and that's actually from a French translation. So in this period that I'm talking about, there is a lot of a very hazy misrecognition. There's not a systematic attempt to begin to understand the learning, which has happened really in places like Italy. So there I think it is happening in the late 15th century. And I've written about this before with my old dear mentor Lisa Jardine. We wrote a book in 2000 called Global Interest, Renaissance Art Between East and West. And we were looking particularly at that interface between the Ottomans and the High Renaissance in Italy. In England, it is more attenuated, and it doesn't happen until later. So the later moment, and I talk about it just at the end of the book, that it's really a moment in the mid-17th century that starts to happen. So in 1632 is the first Laudian professorship in Oxford in Arabic. So a figure is appointed to actually teach Arabic. And then there is a circulation of manuscripts, particularly around medicine, which are coming back through the East India Company and the Levant Company in places like Aleppo. So Edward Pocock is appointed. He's a chaplain in Aleppo. He comes back. He's given the Laudian professorship. So it's really from that moment in the 1630s, and then you start to get the Quran sort of circulating. But we know Marlowe is reading the Quran. So Christopher Marlowe in Tamburlaine has Tamburlaine burn the Quran, and he's citing bits from the Quran. So Marlowe certainly, we think, has got hold of probably a garbled Latin translation of the Quran. And of course now it's a very problematic play to perform. The last time it was performed, just after 7/7, that scene was cut from the play. So don't tell me that the Elizabethan drama doesn't still have an impact, because they censored it and they couldn't put that scene in with the burning of the Quran.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a sort of slightly later moment in the English tradition. It's sort of more mid-17th century. And that's when, if you look at people who are writing about the histories of Orientalism, that's where they will start that story. So mine is very much, as David was saying, it's about the travellers who are trying to understand what they see Islam as being. There's still not a clear understanding of the theology as they try and work out Sunni and Shia, and they try and understand, who's worshipping what. But there's still traditions which just say it's either heresy or it's paganism. A lot of the Elizabethan dramatists are still saying it's a sort of weird pagan belief system that we just don't understand. So there still isn't an understanding of comparative religion at this point. So I'd say less so in England. But it is happening in Central Europe. Those texts are circulating. They are being printed. And especially, as I say, around subjects like medicine and philosophy.
Other question? Right at the back there, yes.
Does this intercourse between England and Constantinople lead to any settled Muslim population in England at that time, or is it just diplomatic legates?
It's mainly diplomacy, but there are various scattered records that people are putting together. Miranda Kaufman, who works at the Institute for Historical Research, actually just mailed me yesterday and said, I read your book, and I've got records of 360 figures throughout the Tudor period who are given terms like blackamoors, Turks, Saracens, and these weird terms, we've usually racialized them. We said this is a question about race, and people are so obsessed by saying the black presence in England. Actually, I think what we've misunderstood is it's an Islamic presence, because they are called things like blackamoors. Well, if they're called blackamoors, that means that they're from effectively modern-day Morocco, which means that they will be Muslim. The records suggest that there is no settled community, as there is with Jews. So Jim Shapiro wrote the great book Shakespeare and the Jews, saying, we've always thought there was no Jewish community. There probably was a tiny, tiny minority of a Jewish community that were secretly worshipping. I think that that's probably the case here. from certainly from this period, not much earlier. I think from the 1570s, 80s, 90s. So I have a great record of a guy called Chinano the Turk, who is captured, get this, he's captured by Francis Drake when he raids Cartagena in Colombia in the late 1570s, because he's being this guy, Chinano the Turk, is being captured by the Spanish, enslaved in the Mediterranean, taken to the New World. He's living in Colombia. Drake attacks Colombia, grabs this guy with many other Turks, takes him back to London. This guy then converts. I have an account of an English Puritan divine saying, "Hallelujah, a Muslim has converted to Protestantism, and that's it, the floodgates will open now." Didn't happen. So you've got these interesting moments where, as it were, a tiny community sort of appears and then disappears. And obviously there's no record that they keep themselves. It's a later 17th century moment where that starts to happen. But I think, yes, there are small groups. And my friend Al-Anuri is cited as openly worshipping in the Strand, because they say he worships with using beads and he faces the east, and they describe halal meat, they say, and they cut up their meat in a very strange way. And these are descriptors which suggest that there's more going on than we've ever realized.
Other question? Can I ask another one then? In this period, how did the rest of Europe look on Elizabeth's England? I mean, were they suspicious of her because she was mixing with strange foreigners? Or?
Absolutely. So there's endless chatter from the Spanish, particularly, and the papacy, saying, and it's openly discussed, this is absolutely appalling, that the two grand heresies have allied with each other. Of course, the Dutch are thrilled. So the Dutch are also reaching out to the Islamic world. So the Dutch revolt against, of course, Spanish Catholicism is saying, this is great. And Elizabeth, of course, is supporting the Dutch revolt in the Low Countries. And so there's an Anglo-Dutch Islamic alliance going on across this fractured Christian world picture. But certainly, the papacy and the Spanish are saying, this is appalling. And they're saying it's appalling, of course, officially, because they think it's a terrible sort of theological travesty. But they're also saying it's appalling because they're really scared of the military and political might that the Ottomans in particular give Elizabeth. I mean, other people have said this, not me. Sir Noel Malcolm, who wrote a great book called Agents of Empire last year, and he's much grander than me, so I defer to him saying, because I like sort of trying to be more provocative, but Sir Noel Malcolm will say, there are many challenges to Catholic orthodoxy before the 16th century, and they all got snuffed out. So Noel Malcolm and I think, would agree on saying that if it wasn't for the presence of the Ottoman Islamic axis that Protestantism allied itself with in the 16th century, Protestantism wouldn't have survived. But because particularly the Spanish Catholic Habsburgs had to fight on two fronts, they had to fight against Lutheran Protestantism, and they had to fight the Ottomans, that meant that they couldn't focus all their energies on crushing the Lutheran Reformation. And if there hadn't have been that Islamic presence, they probably would have done. So it's a kind of extraordinary what if, but it tells you that 16th century European Renaissance moment is very, very different to what we've been led to believe it might be. And I should just add, it's simply about training, right? So I'm trained in Renaissance studies, and if you do that, that means that you are taught to try and do Greek, not very well, Latin, a bit better. You are not then, and in manuscript studies, right? But you are not in any way presumed to learn maybe any Arabic or Turkish or Persian, which actually you really should be doing if you're working in this period, because there's open transactions between an East and West that doesn't exist. Here we are talking about beyond borders. There is no border between East and West in this period. We've made that border up in the period.
That's a crucial thing.
Yeah, we've completely made it up. So even the language that we use about this period is very, very problematic. I don't like the title of my own book, The Islamic World. What does that mean? Again, in the 16th century, if you're in Morocco and you're part of the Saadian dynasty, you just laugh. People are so clear about the distinctions between that world. We are, because we're fine about saying Renaissance Florence, London, Antwerp, and so on. We don't give a hoot that Baghdad's been flattened. It's like flattening Florence. right? If we suddenly flattened Renaissance Florence, there'd be an absolute uproar. We know partly what people are saying about Aleppo, but the loss of manuscripts in somewhere like Baghdad is just devastating for this period. But nobody in the Anglo-American academic world gives a hoot, and that's shocking.
Anybody else? Yes, lady at the back there. Just wait for the microphone, yeah.
What sparked your interest in the topic?
I think it's my heritage. It's coming from where I come from. And I'll tell you a funny story. The funny story is that I was given, as a young radical, I was given Peking Press off-prints of Trotsky and Marx to read by a Sikh who went on to be an engineer, and he was a radical Trotskyist. I mean, talk about Jeremy Corbyn entryism. This is the 1980s, and I remember him coming in one day. I was in the 5th form at school, and he came in and he said, "Hooray!" He said, "We have just killed Indira Gandhi," and Indira Gandhi had just been assassinated. We were 15 and we were reading Trotsky and Marx, and I was being told by a Sikh who was proselytizing me as a Trotskyist that he was celebrating a sectarian assassination. This is in Bradford, a long time before, the Satanic Verses. So for me, and that was, of course, a terrible story. And it taught me a lot about radical politics. And I stopped reading Peking Press Trotskyists because that was his line. That was his position. That he was a Trotskyist, but he was celebrating the death of Indira Gandhi by her Sikh bodyguards. And I remember thinking, that's kind of quite intriguing to be in Bradford at this point, and those kind of histories colliding.
Now,
So for me,
you've twice said in the course of this session that we're all ignorant about the division between Sunni and Shia, and that is true. So give us, just to end up, a 2-minute tutorial on the difference. Nice, easy question.
I'm not going to. Actually, well, that's what's interesting, isn't it? Because my point here is that I do not tell this story from the Islamic side. Okay, I do not speak Arabic. I do not speak Turkish. I am saying that what I want this work to do is encourage the fact that this should be a two-way discussion. Right? I now have stopped this work. I cannot do this work any further because it then becomes classic Orientalism, as Edward Said defined it. Said said, this is about the West creating an image of the Orient by Westerners, and that's been an 18th and 19th tradition. And it's why this story has never been told. It's why throughout the 19th and 20th century, people have just thought it's not been relevant to tell that story. So my problem is that I say I cannot go any further. This work now has to be collaborative. I need to and want to work with Turkish scholars, with Moroccan scholars, with Iranian scholars. I need to be working in those archives. And Richard Bacon's looking at me because he's in the Committee for Iranian Affairs, and he knows that this is a real problem. Even when I say that, I say, yeah, we should be working in Iran in the archives. Fat chance. Yeah. Right? At the moment, politically, the problem that we have is so profound. So I can't speak, as it were, for that tradition. I want to work with people. As the sciences do, that's what we should be doing. Because my training only takes me so far. And at a certain point, I can't go beyond that. It's almost, you're sort of now almost asking, how does it work from the other side? And it's an interesting question. What do the Ottomans say about their alliances and engagements with Elizabethan England? I can only find so much of that in the archives here in the UK. I suspect that if we get into those other archives, what's left of them that hasn't been destroyed by bombing, we find out remarkable stories. Probably about what Islam thought of the Protestant Catholic sectarian split.
They understand it better than we did.
They probably understand it as much and better. And certainly, as I say, that is what I start to hear at certain points in the story that I tell, is that both sides are saying, we're both ripping our religions to pieces. Sunni and Shia are looking at Catholic and Protestant and vice versa. And there is a great moment, a play which is actually in Orient Castle, the first play by William Percy, that puts the Prophet Muhammad on stage. And it's written in 1600, 1601. It's a manuscript play which was probably never performed. Yeah. And again, he's talking about an attempt to overcome the Sunni-Shia sectarian conflict, just like the Protestant-Catholic conflict, which is ripping Europe and England apart, even as he writes in 1600.
Well, now our time has come to an end, and Jerry Brotton will be signing copies of his book, This Orient Isle, across the way. Meantime, please give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. Thank you. Thank you.